For decades, the world believed they knew her story. Jerry Hall, Texas-born, Paris-forged, the golden goddess of the runway, was the woman who had it all. Beauty, fame, fortune, and a marriage that bound her to the most notorious rock star alive. She seemed untouchable, the one who had walked through chaos and emerged crowned as Mrs. Mick Jagger. But history has a cruel way of rewriting itself, because when the truth surfaced, the crown disappeared, and with it, nearly 20 years of her life. In 1990, millions of fans saw the photographs. Jerry Hall, radiant in Balinese wedding attire, standing at the side of Mick Jagger as they exchanged vows on an island steeped in myth. The images were drenched in ritual and romance, and the world assumed the fairy tale was finally sealed. After years of scandal and betrayal, Jerry Hall had, at last, become the bride she had always been promised to be. But decades later, in a courtroom oceans away from Bali, that fairy tale crumbled. Judges ruled the ceremony legally meaningless. The marriage never existed, not on paper, not in law, not in the eyes of history. Jerry Hall, who had raised 4 children as Jagger's wife, who had endured humiliation after humiliation with the dignity of a queen, was told she had never been a wife at all. It was as if 2 decades of her life had been nothing more than theater, a carefully staged illusion that dissolved the moment the curtain fell. This was the darkest twist of Jerry Hall's story, the revelation that what the world had celebrated was never real. But the Bali illusion is only the surface. Beneath it lies an even deeper paradox. A woman who stood at the intersection of 2 empires, one ruled by guitars and chaos, the other by headlines and boardrooms. She lived through both, first beside Mick Jagger, and later as the wife of media titan Rupert Murdoch, navigating from rock's hedonistic extremes to the cold machinery of corporate power. 2 men who could not have been more different, yet both left her with legacies of silence, questions, and shadows. Her journey is not just the tale of a supermodel who conquered fashion and fame. It is the anatomy of survival within systems built to consume women like her. Jerry Hall was adored and objectified, exalted and diminished, crowned and erased in all one lifetime. She was the muse whose beauty defined an era, yet her most enduring chapters were written in courtrooms and behind closed doors, far from the cameras that once idolized her. What makes her story haunting isn't the glamour, it's the gaps. The moments when the record goes silent, when the truth is withheld, when the woman herself chooses not to explain. Why did she endure so much betrayal before Bali? Why did she embrace silence when her marriage to Murdoch dissolved in 2022? Why has she never fully told her side of the story? Each unanswered question becomes another shadow cast over her legend. This is the story of Jerry Hall, not the glossy fantasy, but the hidden truth that survived 2 decades of illusion. Tonight, we begin with the marriage that never was and the mysteries that still refuse to die. Jerry Faye Hall was born in 1956 in Gonzales, Texas, a place where the horizon stretched wider than most dreams dared to go. She was one of 6 children, raised in a modest household where discipline was strict and escape often existed only in imagination. In that small-town world, Jerry stood out like lightning on a clear sky, tall, willowy, and already carrying the kind of presence that seemed destined for something larger than life. Yet beauty, in a place like Gonzales, was not a crown, but a burden. Jerry's striking looks made her different, and different was dangerous in a community that valued conformity. The tall blonde girl was whispered about, admired, envied, and scrutinized all at once. That scrutiny only sharpened her hunger to leave. She studied French in school, devoured fashion magazines, and rehearsed in her mind the escape route from Texas flatlands to a city where beauty could become currency, not curse. By 16, Jerry Hall had turned her dreams into action. She left for Paris, armed with little more than ambition and the kind of daring only youth provides. For most, this would have been reckless. For Jerry, it was inevitable. In Paris, her looks, once a source of alienation, were transformed into pure capital. She was quickly signed to a top modeling agency, and within months she was splashed across the pages of Elle and Vogue. The Paris of the early 1970s was not just a city, it was an experiment. Nightclubs pulsed with excess, fashion blurred with rebellion, and beauty was treated like a commodity in constant demand. For Jerry, this was both paradise and trap. She became the muse of legendary photographers like Helmut Newton and Antonio Lopez, who immortalized her as the quintessential blonde bombshell of the decade. She embodied a new kind of supermodel, bold, unapologetic, a woman who looked like she could burn the world and still smile for the camera. But paradise carried shadows. Behind the runway lights lurked predatory figures, older men who saw young models not as artists but as trophies. The parties that seemed glamorous to outsiders were, for Jerry, tests of endurance. Champagne flowed, drugs circulated, and the line between performance and survival blurred dangerously. To remain afloat, Jerry mastered a skill that would define her life, the art of playing roles. She became whatever was required, cool muse, wild party girl, ethereal goddess, while keeping her truest self locked away. Even then, the foreshadowing was clear. She was adored, but also consumed. Paris taught Jerry Hall the rules of the game. Beauty would open doors, but it would also invite predators. Fame would elevate her, but it would also isolate her. She had left Texas to escape scrutiny, but in Paris the scrutiny was relentless, magnified by camera lenses and men who saw her as canvas for their fantasies. By her early 20s, Jerry Hall had everything she thought she wanted: money, fame, access to the inner sanctums of fashion. But what she could not yet see was that she was being rehearsed for a larger, darker role, the role of muse to a man whose appetite for excess made Paris look tame. And when she met Mick Jagger, the stage was set for a drama that would consume the next 20 years of her life. By the mid-1970s, Jerry Hall had become more than just a model. She was a phenomenon. Her face, framed by waves of golden hair, graced the covers of Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and Harper's Bazaar. Designers clamored for her presence on their runways. Photographers worshipped her ability to shift from icy elegance to radiant seduction with the tilt of a chin. She was tall, commanding, unforgettable. Jerry Hall wasn't just part of fashion, she was shaping it. But fame alone didn't crown her. It was her relationship with Mick Jagger that pushed her from celebrated model into the mythology of pop culture. Their worlds collided in the late 1970s when Jerry was already established as a supermodel and Jagger was the restless king of rock. Together, they were a spectacle, beauty and infamy, elegance and danger, a goddess standing beside a man the world believed could never be tamed. For the press, it was irresistible. Paparazzi followed them relentlessly. Jerry stepping into limousines in couture gowns, Jagger swaggering in his rock star armor, the pair photographed on yachts, at premieres, on distant beaches. They became a living symbol of glamour, fashion fused with rock, perfection fused with chaos. To outsiders, Jerry Hall had ascended to Olympus. She had it all, the dream career and the ultimate rock star husband. But Olympus is never without storms. Behind the flashbulbs, their life was anything but serene. Jagger's infidelities became a recurring headline, sometimes whispered, sometimes screamed in tabloid bold letters. Jerry Hall stood beside him through it all. At parties, she laughed as though unbothered. At galas, she shone like gold. Yet friends described her as exhausted, perpetually caught between anger and loyalty, between humiliation and hope. The 1980s intensified everything. Jerry Hall had 4 children with Jagger, cementing their partnership in the public eye, but betrayal followed her at every turn. While she smiled on magazine covers, tabloids gleefully reported Jagger's affairs with actresses, models, and socialites. Jerry had become both muse and martyr, the goddess who inspired and the woman who endured. And yet, paradoxically, this period also defined her power. She was no longer just a model orbiting the star of Mick Jagger. She was herself a cultural force. Jerry Hall embodied resilience, a kind of grace under fire that made her more than a victim of Jagger's chaos. She walked runways while heavily pregnant, posed for iconic campaigns, and appeared in films, proving she was more than a pretty face clinging to a rock legend. Still, the cracks were undeniable. Every public smile was shadowed by private grief. Every glamorous photograph was matched by a headline about betrayal. Jerry Hall had reached the peak of glamour, but it was a glamour laced with poison. She had everything, and yet she was constantly reminded of how fragile it all was. Then, in 1990, came the ceremony in Bali. To the world, it seemed like the resolution of decades of turbulence. Jerry Hall and Mick Jagger finally united in marriage, a spectacle of exotic beauty and ancient ritual. The goddess had won her crown, the world believed, but the truth that the ceremony would later be declared invalid was the hidden fracture running beneath the surface. The marriage that seemed to legitimize her sacrifices was in reality an illusion waiting to collapse. The cracks in Jerry Hall's life had widened, and soon they would break her carefully constructed image apart. By the late 1980s, Jerry Hall had mastered a dangerous art, the ability to look unbreakable while living inside fractures. To the cameras, she was luminous, poised, the eternal consort of Mick Jagger. But in private, the walls were cracking. The betrayals had grown impossible to hide. Jagger's appetite for affairs was insatiable, and the tabloids documented each transgression with glee. Names of actresses, models, and socialites appeared beside his in bold print, turning Jerry Hall's humiliation into a public sport. Her silence, once seen as grace, began to look like endurance bordering on cruelty. Cruelty inflicted not just by Jagger, but by the world that expected her to smile through it. Yet Jerry Hall continued to play her role with discipline. At premieres, she dazzled in couture gowns. At Rolling Stones concerts, she stood at the edge of the stage, the image of loyalty. For the press, it was a fairy tale still intact, the goddess forgiving, the rock star adored, the children binding them in permanence. But beneath the surface, the fairy tale was rotting. Then came Bali. In November 1990, the couple staged a wedding ceremony on the Indonesian island steeped in Balinese Hindu rituals. The images that emerged were unforgettable. Jerry Hall, adorned in golden headdress and ornate garments, radiant as a queen, Mick Jagger at her side, their vows witnessed in an exotic paradise. The world believed the story had reached its climax. Jerry Hall had finally secured her rightful place as Mrs. Jagger. But reality was more ruthless. The ceremony, though grand and symbolic, held no legal standing under British or Indonesian law. At the time, Jerry herself may not have fully grasped the fragility of the moment. For nearly a decade afterward, she lived under the title of wife, raising her children and believing the sacrifices of 2 decades had culminated in permanence. The irony was brutal. The very ceremony meant to close wounds only deepened them. What was supposed to legitimize her story turned out to be its cruelest trick. The bride the world celebrated was in fact a bride that never existed. The cracks widened into chasms. Jagger's affairs continued even after Bali, most notoriously with model Luciana Murad, which resulted in the birth of another child outside his relationship with Jerry. That betrayal was the breaking point. What the tabloids painted as another scandal was, for Jerry, the collapse of everything she had endured. And when she finally turned to the courts in the late 1990s, seeking divorce, she discovered the ultimate cruelty. The marriage was void. The vows, the headdress, the photographs that filled front pages, it had all been a mirage. The cracks behind Jerry Hall's image were no longer invisible. They had erupted into the open, stripping her not only of her identity as Mrs. Jagger, but also of the narrative she had carried for nearly 20 years. What happens to a woman when history itself erases her role? That was the question Jerry Hall was now forced to answer. The day Jerry Hall entered the courtroom in 1999, she carried with her more than legal documents. She carried 2 decades of sacrifice, 4 children, and the world's perception of her as Mrs. Mick Jagger. She was not there simply to untangle property or custody. She was there to affirm that the life she had endured through scandal, betrayal, and humiliation had meaning. But the law had no sentimentality. The judges ruled with cold precision. The Balinese ceremony of 1990 was legally void. Jerry Hall, in the eyes of the courts, had never been Mick Jagger's wife. The marriage the world celebrated was reduced to a ceremony without binding power, a romantic gesture that held no place in legal history. With that single verdict, Jerry Hall's identity was rewritten. She had been erased from the official record of Jagger's life, recast not as wife, but as long-term companion. The humiliation was staggering. Newspapers that once celebrated her exotic wedding now splashed headlines about her invalid marriage. To the public, she became both tragic and ironic, the glamorous supermodel who had lived 20 years in a love story that never truly existed. Every image from Bali, every photograph of her in golden headdress, suddenly looked less like proof of devotion and more like evidence of a cruel illusion. Financially, the ruling changed everything. Without legal recognition as Jagger's wife, Jerry Hall was entitled to far less than she had expected. The fortune she believed was hers to claim as security for her children was suddenly precarious. But beyond money, the deeper wound was psychological. For 2 decades, she had played the role of wife, bearing children, managing a household, enduring betrayals, and the law dismissed it as though it had never happened. Friends described her devastation as profound. Yet even in the midst of this erasure, Jerry Hall's resilience surfaced. She refused to collapse publicly. She continued to appear in public, regal and composed, as though determined to remind the world that she could not be reduced to a legal technicality. Still, the scars were undeniable. A woman once hailed as the only person who could tame Mick Jagger had been publicly stripped of that title. The breaking point was not only the court's decision, it was the realization that history itself could betray her. She had given the world her youth, her beauty, her loyalty, and in return, she was told she was never truly what she believed herself to be. It was a verdict that left her life story fractured, its most celebrated chapter nullified with the stroke of a pen. But Jerry Hall was not finished. Out of the ashes of one empire, she would step into another, this time into the arms of a man whose power was not measured in guitars or scandals, but in headlines and boardrooms. If her years with Mick Jagger had been a carnival of chaos, her next chapter would be an immersion into the cold precision of media power. And once again, the world would ask, was Jerry Hall shaping her destiny or merely surviving someone else's empire? If Mick Jagger embodied chaos, Rupert Murdoch embodied control. When Jerry Hall married the media mogul in 2016, the world was stunned. She was 60, he was 84, and their union looked less like a love story and more like a merger of image and influence. To some, it was redemption. After the humiliation of Bali, Jerry Hall had finally secured a legitimate marriage. To others, it was a puzzle. Why would a woman once synonymous with freedom and glamour bind herself to the most guarded man in global media? The wedding itself was starkly different from Bali's exotic spectacle. No golden headdress, no island rituals, just a quiet ceremony in London's Fleet Street, once the heart of Murdoch's empire. It was less fairy tale, more transaction. Yet, Jerry smiled, radiant as ever, and the press painted her as the woman who had found stability after decades of turbulence. But whispers began almost immediately. Some insiders suggested Murdoch was possessive, uncomfortable with Jerry's enduring ties to Jagger in the world of rock. Others claimed her social circle shifted dramatically, curated to fit her role as the wife of a man whose empire influenced elections and shaped public opinion. Friends remarked that Jerry Hall's once vivacious personality seemed muted, her sharp wit replaced by a carefully maintained silence. To the public, she played her part with the same discipline she had mastered as a model, poised, smiling, inscrutable. But the contrast was stark. The woman once photographed barefoot at midnight in Paris nightclubs was now photographed entering boardrooms in Murdoch's shadow. If Jagger's chaos had threatened to consume her, Murdoch's control threatened to erase her. Then, in 2022, came the abrupt announcement. Jerry Hall and Rupert Murdoch were divorcing. No details were given, no scandal splashed across headlines. It was simply over. Unlike the courtroom circus with Jagger, this separation came cloaked in near total silence. Jerry offered no interviews, no confessions, no explanations. She disappeared from the spotlight as quickly as the news broke, leaving the world to speculate. Why had she walked away? Did she leave on her own terms, or was she once again cast aside by forces larger than herself? Had she grown weary of playing roles in empires that never truly belonged to her? The silence was deafening and powerful. In an age when celebrities overshare, Jerry Hall's refusal to explain became its own act of defiance. Silence was not just absence, it was a weapon. And perhaps that silence is what makes her story more haunting than any scandal. After decades of living in the glare of two of the world's most powerful men, Jerry Hall stepped back into the shadows on her own terms. Whether that silence shields pain, dignity, or secrets we will never know, it remains the sharpest twist in a life already filled with contradictions. But silence cannot erase legacy. As the dust settled on her marriages to both rock's wildest frontman and media's coldest emperor, Jerry Hall emerged as something more enduring, a survivor whose beauty, resilience, and mystery outlasted the empires that once consumed her. And that legacy, the paradox of glamour and erasure, devotion and betrayal, brings us to the final question. What remains of Jerry Hall when the illusions are stripped away? When the empires faded, the stage lights of rock, the cold glow of media boardrooms, Jerry Hall remained. That in itself is a legacy. She survived two of the most powerful men of their generations, not as a silent footnote, but as a woman whose story continues to intrigue because of what was revealed and, more importantly, what was withheld. Her greatest triumph was not being a muse to Jagger or a wife to Murdoch, but being a mother. With Jagger, she had 4 children, Elizabeth, James, Georgia May, and Gabriel. Each grew into lives of their own, carrying fragments of both parents' charisma, but unmistakably shaped by Jerry's resilience. To raise them in the center of storms, tabloid scandals, courtroom humiliations, and the suffocating scrutiny of fame was an act of quiet heroism. Her children never became tragic victims of their parents' chaos, and that is perhaps Jerry Hall's most enduring accomplishment. Her beauty, too, tells a story of defiance. In an industry addicted to reinvention through scalpels and injections, Jerry Hall aged naturally. Her tall, statuesque presence remains commanding, her face lined with the kind of stories no surgeon can erase. She once said she preferred to wear her life on her face, and in doing so she became a rare figure, a woman who aged without apology in a culture that punishes women for time. Yet it is the paradox of her public image that lingers. She was the woman who seemed to have everything, yet twice found her most intimate roles dissolved by forces outside her control. With Jagger, she was told she had never truly been a wife. With Murdoch, she vanished from the narrative without explanation. Both times, she was defined by absence, the bride who never existed, the wife who left in silence. And maybe that is why Jerry Hall's legacy feels unfinished. She gave the world so much visibility, covers, campaigns, red carpets, yet kept her deepest truths just out of reach. She never released a tell-all memoir. She never gave the confessional interview that tabloids craved. Instead, she let speculation swirl while she remained composed, as though the mystery itself was her final act of control. Her story forces us to confront unsettling questions. What does it mean when a woman builds her life inside the shadows of men whose power dwarfs her own? What happens when history erases the roles she believed she held? And most haunting of all, how much of Jerry Hall's truth have we never heard, and perhaps never will? In the end, Jerry Hall's life is not a fairy tale, but a cautionary epic. She is a reminder that glamour often hides wounds, that survival is sometimes the sharpest form of power, and that silence can echo louder than any confession. She outlived 2 empires, yes, but did she ever truly escape them? That is the mystery Jerry Hall leaves us with.